Yo, what's up, boys and girls? It's your boy Swolelax here, and I'm back at it again in the video. This time, something a little bit different. So today, we got an update to the UA deck profile that we did a little while back. I love this deck a lot. UA monsters have been some of my favorite things to play recently, and I really like this deck. I've made it more consistent with some updates and new tech and new cards that are available because of the ban list. So, yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. First, we start off with 3 copies of UA Midfielder. So this card right here is your main combo monster of the deck. You want to see this card as often as possible. Now, all the UA monsters have the same first effect. That is, if you control a UA monster on the field already, and you have a different UA monster in your hand, well, then you can bounce this one to the field and bounce this one back to your hand by special summoning, which is actually really good. That whole effect is kind of the main mechanic of the UA monsters, and they all do different things, different big buff boys and whatnot. But UA Midfielder is your only your only level 4 in the deck. It's your only normal summon primarily you're going to be using. Now, there are more cards that you're able to get this card out sooner, but you're only running 3 of them. Trust me, if you could run more, then you would. But he's super good. Also, he has a secondary effect, which you're not going to be using too often, but allows you to special summon out a UA monster from hand by bouncing back another UA monster you control back to your hand and special summon out the other guy. So that's okay, and it's pretty good, and it can help in certain situations and certain combos, but primarily you're just using this guy to normal summon him and special summon out a bigger dude. So 3 of those for sure. Next, we're running 3 copies of UA Dreadnought Dunker. The Dunker is super sick. So this guy, 2,500 attack, is super respectable, but it's not hard to get this dude to insane levels of attack. Plus, he does great things with his secondary effect. He does piercing damage, and if he does battle damage to your opponent, then he can target a card on the field and he can destroy it. So targeting destruction is not necessarily super good anymore, blah, 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 but that's actually really, really insane. This card has won me several duels and is your big muscle of the deck. I'm seeing a lot of builds only running 2 of this card. Absolutely crazy, and they're insane and wrong. 3 of them are a must. Next, we're running 2 copies of UA Rival Rebounder. UA Rival Rebounder is super good in this deck as more of a defensive option. He is a little bit more of a flex play. Honestly, he's just another UA monster to get your combos off if you want to be real. Because his secondary effect allows you to special summon out UA monsters from your hand or graveyard if he's special summoned a certain way, which can be really good. But unfortunately, he doesn't that doesn't necessarily do a whole lot. Especially in the deck. And if you get around to playing it, you'll kind of see what I mean. But 2,200 attack and 2,300 defense are nothing to shake a stick at. So, you know, he's pretty good. He's pretty okay. 2 of those, I think, are fine. And next, we're running 2 copies of UA Mighty Slugger. I almost said Rival Slugger. And 2 copies of Perfect Ace. Mighty Slugger and Perfect Ace. Now, despite these cards also being thematically similar, they are similar in the fact that they are your flex and option plays as far as monsters go in this deck. Now, they're both very utility-based. Mighty Slugger is more of your attack, poking, and prodding, and UA Perfect Ace is like your defensive wall. So, 2,300 attack for Mighty Slugger. Mighty Slugger allows you to do is when you attack your opponent, then your opponent cannot activate spells or traps cards in the field, and now that back row is coming back into play and come back into style, this card is insanely good, and I like him a lot. You could run 3 of this card, you could run 3 either of these cards, but I'm finding 2 and 2 are a good mix. Perfect Ace is your wall is your defensive play on your opponent's turn. If they want to activate a card effect, well, then you can discard a card and negate that effect. So you got to pick and choose what you want to negate, obviously. But in addition to that, it's not necessarily a hard once per turn. So if you have 2 Perfect Ace on the field, well, you can negate 2 effects. So he is really, really good and can be kind of a hindrance if your opponent can't necessarily deal with them. So 2 of each of these are great. Next, we're running 1 copy of UA Blockbacker, your buff boy of the deck. 2,700 defense. This dude is a beast. He's a monster. And the second part of your defense. So, Blockbacker, what allows you to do is when your opponent special summons out a monster or monsters, then you can change their battle positions, and if you do, then you can negate their effects. So that is really good. Not as good as something like Perfect Ace, which can negate effects across the board, but he is still pretty beefy, and he's another UA monster you can cycle out and extend combos with. So having him along with Perfect Ace is a really, really good defensive wall. So it kind of stops, but it prevents certain special summons, and it can negate effects. So Blockbacker, one of those, is perfectly fine. And that's all your monsters are going to be running. This deck does have quite a bit of monsters, but primarily just UAs is a great engine for this deck. I think it's sick, so yeah. And we're going to go ahead and get into the spell cards of this deck. We got 3 copies of UA Stadium and 2 copies of Terraforming to Search. So UA Stadium is another piece of your combo. You want to see this card as often as possible and as much as possible. Now, I know acknowledging you saying that, I'm only running 2 Terraforming, but I've updated the deck in ways that make this card more consistent, and you're able to see this more often. But we'll get into that later. UA Stadium is super good. What it allows you to do is if you normal summon a UA monster, you can search any other UA monster from your deck to your hand. And if a UA monster is special summoned, well, then they all gain 500 attack that turn. So that is super good, and that 500 stacks the next turn, and yada, yada, yada. But the combo you essentially want to be doing now is you have UA Stadium on the board, you summon out midfielder, you activate UA Stadium, search a dude to your hand, and bounce midfielder back to your hand. So that way you set up your defense, set up an offense, or do whatever. So this card is insanely good, and you definitely want to see it as often as possible, and if you can, within your opening turns to start off your plays and combos. Next, we're running 3 copies of UA Signing Deal. So UA Signing Deal is another powerful card enabling you to get access to your UA monsters. UA Signing Deal is kind of like your Hero Lives of the deck. You can special summon out a UA monster from your deck by paying 300 times its level. So that is super insanely good. Now, the big drawback for this card is that their effects are negated. Psych, that's not a drawback, kind of. So what I mean by that is, if you activate UA Signing Deal, let's say special summon out midfielder onto your field, but his effects are negated, well, if you have another UA monster in your hand, you can bounce that guy to the field, bounce UA monster back to your hand, and then you can special summon back UA midfielder to the field with his effects totally intact. And that's just an example. But you feel me? You understand what I'm trying to say? You essentially do that little roundabout way of getting your monster's effects back, and then you can special summon again and do what have you. UA Signing Deal is insanely good in a pinch, and it's a really good comeback tool inside this deck. There are scenarios where you don't necessarily have anything else to play, so you do play UA Signing Deal and have an effect negated monster out on the field, but that's totally okay because your monsters are still pretty beefy as they are. And in addition, this is also a great way to gain access to a midfielder if you don't see him out in your opening hand. So I'm running 3 of those for sure. Next, I'm talking about a very powerful spell card inside this deck, and that's going to be 3 copies of UA Powered Jersey. So UA Powered Jersey is incredible. This card, what it allows you to do is you can equip it to a UA monster. It gains 1,000 attack points. It can, any battle damage your opponent takes is doubled, and if you destroy a monster by battle, you can make a secondary attack that turn. It is crazy, crazy good. It is also stackable, so if you want to swag on your opponent or style them a little bit, you can make multiple of them onto a UA monster. I once did that with the Dreadnought Dunker, and I think I had it to like 7,000 attack, and I won for game. I just like swung, went nuts. It was insane. So the biggest drawback to this card, all those great benefits, what allows you to do is that if you leave it on the field, and this is actually pretty important, if you leave it on the field after your turn is done, the monster that you control gets banished during your standby phase. So that kind of sucks. Now, the way this card is super smartly designed is that the UA Power Jersey, if the monster is sent back to your hand, then this card can also be sent back to your hand, so that looming threat is still there. So that's actually really good, because the idea is you go into the main phase 1, you set up your combos, summon out Dreadnought Dunker ideally, you get into 4,000 attack with this card on the field and your hand, and then you swing for game. If you don't get game because of the insane amount of damage that you just outputted, then you go to main phase 2. You bounce Dreadnought Dunker or whoever back to your hand, and then this card gets back to your hand as well. So that is actually super good, and this card is a 3 of. You want to see this card as often as possible, and it's pretty easy to get to him as well. So, next onto the more generic cards in this deck, we got 2 copies of Twin Twisters for back removal. Obviously, back row is getting a little more back end style, so 2 of these really help for that as well. And that card also helps you get something like UA Penalty Box inside the graveyard. Speaking of which, we have 2 copies of Foolish Burial Goods. Foolish Burial Goods is actually an insane card that I never even thought of until recently. Foolish Burial Goods allows you to send a spell or trap card from your deck to the graveyard. So the combo of this is you want to send UA Penalty Box to your graveyard, because then you get effects based off of UA Penalty Box being banished. So that is super good. We're going to get into that a little bit later, but 2 copies of Foolish Burial Goods not only is a good deck thinner, but also opens up a lot more flex and option plays in this deck. So I'm running 2 copies of those. Next, we're running 1 copy of Rhoda, essentially to search out your UA midfielder. 1 copy of Dark Hole as your hashtag Budget Boys Raigeki. And finally, one copy of Monster Reborn. So new ban list out. Monster Reborn is now legal again. This card is super good. I love it. One copy for sure. Next, on to our traps. There's actually quite a bit to talk about them. One copy of Bottomless Trap Hole. I know this card is at 3 right now, but we're kind of not necessarily trying to tool it to more of a control deck, so just 1 for now. It's a pretty good coverage, and it's okay. 3 copies of Storming Mirror Force, and 1 copy of Quaking Mirror Force. So, here's weird. I used to have 2 copies of Quaking, and I used to have 2 copies of Storming in this deck, I believe, and I kind of played around with the ratios a little bit. But what I'm finding is that since links are becoming a lot more prevalent and a little more easy to summon, Storming Mirror Force helps a lot with that, because links are then sent back to their hand, they waste all that material, all that time getting them out there, and then it's gone. Quaking Mirror Force does combo really, really well with something like Dreadnought Dunker, which is piercing damage, and obviously those hold plays and combos, but it's not necessarily winning that often, I'm finding. So 3 copies of Storming. You can play with the ratios. You want to do 1 Storming, 3 Quaking. It doesn't necessarily matter, but just keep in mind that with links being really popular right now, that Storming is a good option against them. So that is what I'm running. Next, I'm running 1 copy of Solemn Warning and 2 copies of Solemn Strike as our Solemn Brigade. Pretty self-explanatory. And finally, we're running 3 copies of UA Penalty Box. So UA Penalty Box is actually really insane. So I used to not be able to talk about this card a lot because there wasn't a lot to it, but here it is. So when this card is more valuable to you in the graveyard than it is on the field. When it's on the field, sure. What it allows you to do is when your UA monster does battle, if it attacks opponent's monster, opponent attacks it, then you can banish that monster until the second standby phase, or their second phase. So that's super good. It allows you a lot of defensive plays, and it's pretty versatile. But in the graveyard, you can banish this card from your graveyard, and then you can take a UA spell or trap card from your deck and add it to your hand. So let's say you're missing UA Stadium. Well, boom, you can get that. Well, let's say you're missing UA Power Jersey. You can get that. Let's say you're missing UA Sign Deal. Well, you can get that too. UA Penalty Box is crazy good inside the graveyard. And so Foolish Burial Goods is the combo that allows, also discarding it with Perfect Ace and also discarding it with Twin Twisters, then that opens up so many more options for this deck, and it boosts the consistency by an insane amount that I never really thought of before. So 3 copies of that for sure. The play with this card, you want to have it inside of your graveyard. Now, it's not necessarily bad if it's on the field, don't get me wrong, but you will get a lot more use of it, trust me, if you banish it from your graveyard, getting your other cards and your combo pieces to your hand. So keep that in mind. So that's it for the deck profile, guys. Thanks for watching. Don't sleep on the UAs. UAs are sick. They're super nuts. They're one of my most fun. They're one of my most fun decks that I've played in a very long time. It's super easy to pilot, and you can get into them really easily. They're also insanely hype and also insanely budget boys. These cards came extremely cheap. It's a great deck to build if you just want to have some fun. But also, if you want to go into the competitive meta, good luck. But you'll have some fun and some hype moments too, I'm sure. So keep that in mind. This deck's super sick, and yeah, don't sleep on it. It's nuts. Let me know down in the comments down below what are decks that you shouldn't sleep on as well. What are some underdog decks that you think that people underestimate, that you think are nuts? But yeah, I guess that's all I gotta say. Peace out.